What's going on, guys? It's Horse Beef here, and I'm bringing you another tier list video. And today we're covering the greatest UFC fighters to never become undisputed champions. And of course, this is inspired by potentially Dustin Poirier's last fight this past weekend against Islam Makhachev. Incredible performance from both men. Loved the fight, and hearing his potential retirement speech made me tear up, man. I was at the point where I wanted to weep. Dustin Poirier is one of my favorite fighters of all time, and I made this list specifically to commemorate him, but also I realized that there are a few fighters out there who have, just tickled the balls of UFC championship, but couldn't quite make it there. And I want to talk about those guys. And let's just get into it, man. Yoel Romero is the first one up. I'm going to put him right in A tier. He potentially deserves to be in S tier because that entire run of scary knockout wins, like guys like Derek Brunson, Chris Weidman. I think in between his fights with Robert Whittaker, he also knocked out Luke Rockhold there too. This dude beat anybody. I think Tim Kennedy as well. I'm blanking on everyone he beat, but it was a pretty extensive list of brutal finishes. He arguably deserves to have a win over Paulo Costa as well, and Israel Adesanya, considering Israel Adesanya only leg kicked and backed up for the entirety of that fight, while Yoel Romero was the one landing the bigger shot. So he could arguably have won a title, and considering some people think that second Robert Whittaker fight was a robbery, Yoel Romero came about as close as you can come to winning a title, so I might even put him up here in S tier because his resume is also quite impressive when you even consider some of those robbery losses that I mentioned. So as of right now, I'm going to put him up there in S tier. Gegard Mousasi. Now, while he wasn't in the UFC for a whole lot of time, a lot of his success did come in Bellator. But when he was in the UFC, he picked up some wins, knockout wins against Dan Henderson, Vitor Belfort, Thiago Santos, just to name a few. I think Chris Weidman as well. Yeah, Chris Weidman. That's crazy. That in and of itself is a great resume. And to come that close to UFC gold, I don't even know if he really fought for that title. I'm not sure if he ever got the opportunity. But Gegard Mousasi has an all-timer resume. When you look at his overall record, I think the guy's like 49-9 or something like that. So even one of the best records in the history of MMA. The dude is a serious all-time great when you think about it. I know I made my all-time great list and didn't consider Gegard Mousasi, but when I think about it, man, he's almost worth a mention when it comes to that debate. So, I'm going to put him in A tier. I think Gegard Mousasi is a great and one of the best to never win the belt, the way I see it, or be undisputed. Nick Diaz as well. Now, his tenure within the UFC isn't that extensive, but while he was in the UFC, picked up a knockout win over Robbie Lawler, younger Robbie Lawler, that is, and a dominant win over BJ Penn, and did fight GSP, so he came close to winning the belt, although kind of screwed around the entire fight and didn't really have a whole lot for GSP. Did have a little bit of success on the feet, picked up a few weird losses here and there. It's like guys like Carlos Condit, but ultimately, Nick Diaz didn't really show a lot within the UFC. And as I said, this is based off of a fighter's tenure in the UFC. So I'm going to put him in, it's either B or C tier because he did beat the ever-living shit out of BJ Penn. Like, beat him to a pulp. Right? And yeah, that knockout over Robbie Lawler was nice too. But yeah, the long suspension for marijuana usage just took a lot away from his career. So I don't want to disrespect Nate Diaz because of that, because that is a huge factor, man. For all we know, Nick Diaz could have ended up becoming champ if he was never unrightfully suspended for the marijuana usage. So I'm going to put him B tier. Ooh, John Fitch. This man was just a victim of GSP. He cleaned out the welterweight division, just a lay and pray monster. If he became champ, he probably would have been the most boring champ in UFC history. Like, realistically, when you think about it, this dude was just a serious lay and pray monster. You're just unfortunate to have to be competing around the same time of prime GSP, and yeah, GSP was just a much better version of John Fitch. Although I think at one point he had like a 16-fight win streak. He's a serious contender, man. So I'm going to put him in B tier. He arguably deserves to be in A tier along there with Gegard Mousasi, just considering that he did clear out that division around that time. Joseph Benavidez, yeah, unfortunate, right? He had to go up against Davison Figueiredo a couple of times, who was an animal. Demetrius Johnson got knocked out by him. Does have a win over Henry Cejudo, which is a very impressive one, and really beat the who's who of 125 back in the day. Scott Jorgensen, Ian McCall, I believe as well. Those old school flyweights. He pretty much beat all of them except for the very best. So I'll put him maybe in C tier, just because at that time I don't think flyweight was really that talent rich as much as it is now. And when he got to that top level, he did fail like each and every time. Although he does have a great record, and a record that's only blemished by the best of the best. At least when he was at his best. And that win to Henry Cejudo I think does elevate him just a little bit. So I'm gonna put him in B tier. Chad Mendes, man, excellent fighter. Another one just like Benavidez, just like John Fitch, just a victim of how elite the current champion was at that time, right? And if you look at the individuals that beat Chad Mendes, Conor McGregor, Alexander Volkanovski, and Jose Aldo a couple of times, right? Other than that, and Frankie Edgar knocked him out as well. So he only got knocked out by all-time greats or beaten by all-time greats. I'm a huge fan of Chad Mendes, and just based off the eye test, like I know his overall record in the UFC, I guess, isn't great, and the resume on display isn't necessarily a great one either. But I think just based off the eye test, how well he did against Jose Aldo that second time around. Did fight Conor McGregor on short notice. But Chad Mendes, if it's based off of the eye test, like I think that Chad Mendes could have beaten Volkanovski on that day if things went a little bit differently. I think he could have beaten Jose Aldo in that second fight if things just went a little bit differently. He was that good and that dangerous. But the resume doesn't really back up my case for him. So I think for that reason, I'll put him probably in B tier as well. Colby Covington, yeah, a few impressive wins under his record. Like the Jorge Masvidal win, I'm not impressed with at all. Personally, like Masvidal at that point was a bit washed and, pushing 40, even like still, I think he was like 37 when he fought Colby. So yeah, out of his prime, most definitely. Looked slow, looked old in that fight. Looked like he aged about 5 years by the end of it. Went over RDA, bit washed Robbie Lawler. I don't know. I don't consider Colby Covington as an all-time great, even at welterweight. Like he's not even like a top 5. He's not even a top 6 welterweight the way I see it, man. Like of all time, he did come close. He did give Kamaru Usman 2 excellent fights. I mean, the first one I thought he was up on the cards going into that 5th round, but then he got finished. And you could even make the argument that he deserves a draw against Kamaru Usman because the way I saw it, watching that fight live, I thought 3, 4, and 5 were Colby Covington's round. He was landing the most shots on the feet. So he did well against Usman, but he just never did well enough. And he did rise to the occasion at the highest level. But when you look at his resume, and you look at the fact that he's even ducking Ian Gary at this point, I don't know. I don't consider Colby Covington to be that high when it comes to this debate in particular. And there are a whole lot of welterweights on this list, which I realize, man. Like guys like Usman and GSP, they just made it so difficult for anyone to touch UFC gold, man. It was crazy. Same victim right here, or same type of victim right here. Colby or fucking Carlos Condit, Jesus Christ, beat everybody. Nasty run leading up to GSP, and arguably gave GSP the hardest run of his career, considering he knocked him down with a head kick. Although of course you could say Johnny Hendricks gave GSP, but juiced up Johnny Hendricks. As far as off the juice goes, Carlos Condit, besides Matt Serra obviously who knocked him out, gave GSP the hardest fight of his career. Did very well in that one. Did get knocked down a few pegs in his late UFC career, but picked up a very extensive string of losses. But I'm a huge fan of Carlos Condit, so I'm going to put him in B tier, a little bit biased maybe. Arguably he deserves to be in C tier, but I will put him in B tier personally. And then we get into Donald Cerrone. Now he is a legend of the sport 100%, and in his early UFC career picked up wins over Edson Barbosa, Eddie Alvarez, Benson Henderson, which are great wins. But yeah, he just never quite got to that UFC gold. Even had a good late career. He had that little run where he beat Anthony Hernandez. I think Ali Quinta in there as well. And he beat one more dude that I'm blanking on. Even got a shot against Tony Ferguson. But I don't know. Whenever he got to that big stage, he just always seemed to get knocked down a few pegs. And yeah, of course, did go on a string of losses to close out his UFC career. But he was just fighting at that point, I think, for the love of it. And when he was at his best, he was one of the best. And just yet another welterweight / lightweight to just be a victim of circumstances, dude. Dominant champions in these divisions were just so hard to beat around these times. But I would say Cerrone deserves probably a place in that B tier as well, the way I see it. Anthony Johnson was just knocking out dudes. If he fought his whole career at 205, I firmly believe he would have been a champion at some point. Knocked out Glover Teixeira, knocked out Alexander Gustafsson, and then ran into DC, and DC handled him with ease. It looked like, I think DC did get hurt at one point by Johnson, but DC's grappling, his wrestling was just way too dominant for him. But seriously, Anthony Johnson, with that power factor, he could have beaten anybody on any given day, I believe, just based off that punch power. He's a serious freak of nature. Rest in peace, Anthony Johnson. You are missed. Witnessing his run at 205 is one that scared me, gave me nightmares. Damn, it's really tough to know where to put him. But I'll put him at A tier. Jacare Souza, this man was terrifying at one point. Picked up wins over Chris Weidman, I think a couple over Derek Brunson, a few more that I'm blanking on, but he was beating the who's who at 185 in his time. Even developed some scary knockout power and good boxing, honestly, at one point in his career. So he was pretty much like Demian Maia, who could knock you out as well. So he was a terrifying force in that middleweight division. But I think C tier is a fair spot to put him. So I'm going to put him at C tier. Alexander Gustafsson, yet another one who knocked out Glover Teixeira, which is a knockout win that has aged very well. As I said, got knocked out by Anthony Johnson. Came very close to beating John Jones in that first fight. The way I saw it, man, at the time, 1, 2, and 3 were arguably Gustafsson's rounds, with 4 and 5 going to John Jones. So if you score it like that, he deserved to beat John Jones. Although upon watching that fight a few times back again, it was a lot closer than I thought. It's not a given that Gustafsson should have won that fight. In my opinion, one of the best boxers to ever step foot in the octagon, and his hands were so clean. But he was beating some very impressive guys, and if it wasn't for John Jones, his presence at 205, I think Gustafsson probably would have become champion. But then I think about it, I'm like, shit, Johnson was there too. And DC, but he came very close to beating DC. He hurt DC in that fight, and I believe it was a split decision, was it not? So he came close, man. He had a great competitive fight with Daniel Cormier. Man, Gustafsson, I'm gonna put him in A tier. Huge fan of his. Very unfortunate. He was always one fighter that I was constantly rooting for, and very unfortunate that he could never capture UFC undisputed gold, or any UFC gold for that matter. And then we get into Gray Maynard. Yeah, Gray's picked up wins over Frankie Edgar, as I said. Nate Diaz in a split decision. Kenny Florian, Jim Miller. So good resume. I would say decent resume. And that win against Frankie Edgar does elevate it, although he did lose the trilogy, as I said. I'll put Gray Maynard in D tier here with Colby Covington. And remember, guys, the rankings in these particular tier lists are not indicative of how I feel about them as fighters. I'm just being as objective as I possibly can and weighing up their respective resumes. Along with a few other factors depending on the fighter, right? Depending on their circumstances at the time. So there are factors that I weigh up in my head, but if you're put at D tier, you're still on this list because you're still one of the best fighters to never win the belt. So think about it like that. It's not about where I rank them. They're all being commemorated for their incredible careers despite not winning a belt. That's the point of this list. If I rank them lower, that's just because I feel like they're less legendary, or their careers were less successful, or they didn't come quite as close to winning a belt as the others on this list. So let's continue. Big Nog, a lot of his success came outside of the UFC, came into the UFC, did win an interim belt against Tim Sylvia, if I remember correctly. Yes, I believe that is the case. Did try to unify and become undisputed against Cain Velasquez, got knocked out. Has picked up some very impressive wins over the course of his career. But if we're talking about his UFC tenure, I guess based off the fact that he became interim champ should propel him a little bit. So for that, but it was against Tim Sylvia. I'll put him at B tier because he did capture interim gold, and he really is an all-time great, man. Big Nog is a legend. And then we get into Demian Maia, who arguably deserves to be in A tier here. So I'm going to put him there. Picked up wins over John Fitch. Submission wins over Carlos Condit. Split decision against Jorge Masvidal, who is next up on this list. Spoiler alert. A bit controversial on that one, though, to be honest. Don Young Kim, Matt Brown, Neil Magny, Ben Askren. Okay, sure. But still, a very illustrious career within the UFC. Came very, very close to capturing UFC gold, I think. Lost against Colby Covington, lost to Kamaru Usman, lost to Tyron Woodley. So he pretty much just lost to the best of the best that were competing around that time. So Demian Maia was just a notch below that championship caliber fighter. I just don't think he was well-rounded enough, leaned too heavily on jiu-jitsu, and didn't have much danger in the striking department. but I still think he's worthy of being an A tier because he only lost really to the best of the best when he was at his best. And then we get Jorge Masvidal. Okay. Does he deserve to be on this list? Arguably not, but I'm going to put him in D tier. I mean, early on in his UFC career or earlier in his UFC career before he took that long hiatus, did get a knockout win over Donald Cerrone, which was impressive. It was a great shot. And then that run when he came back from his hiatus and knocked out Darren Till, who had a lot of hype behind him at that time. Knocked out Ben Askren with that flying knee in a few seconds, and then beat Nate Diaz for the BMF belt. I feel like that run is super overrated. It's legendary for sure, and it made him a huge star. But those wins on their own don't age well, and they're not as impressive as some Masvidal fans may lead you to believe, or may believe that they are themselves. So for that reason, I think Jorge Masvidal represents like the very, very bottom tier of this type of conversation. But I'll have him right here, right beside Colby Covington, hanging out. Yeah, just make up. Whatever happened in the past is the past. It's whatever. Make America great again, right? Rory MacDonald. Okay. He beat Tyron Woodley. Came very, very close to beating Robbie Lawler. I think their first fight was a split decision and then got knocked out in the second one. Dominated Nate Diaz and picked up a few other wins that I am blanking on, but Rory MacDonald, just based on that eye test, when you would watch this man fight, you'd see it in his skill set. This dude had everything that it took to be a champion. He just could not get it done and could not pass that finish line when it came to being champion. So for that reason, I think, even though I'm a huge fan of Rory MacDonald's, I don't know. Actually, you know what? Now that I'm looking at this list, I'm putting Rory MacDonald in B tier. I'm moving Nick Diaz down to C tier. Sorry, Diaz fans. I'm a huge Diaz fan myself, but when it comes to his time in the UFC, he didn't really have a lot of fights in the organization, so I can't rank him that highly. But as I said, the BJ Penn win alone, right? How dominant that was, I think puts him C tier. Okay, fine, C tier for him. Wonderboy Thompson. Just couldn't get past Woodley. Came very, very close. I mean, a draw in a title fight is about as close as you can get to winning undisputed gold. Even some of the wins he's picked up recently. Jeff Neal. Who else has he beaten? Vicente Luque, when Vicente Luque was at his best, when he was an animal. And then that run leading up to the title shot against Woodley arguably deserved to win that fight, depending on who you ask. But I would say a draw was pretty fair, honestly, with that one. I'll put him in A tier. I'm putting him in A tier. Long career within the UFC and great longevity. Came close a couple of times, but no cigar, as is the case with everyone on this list. Uriah Faber, he is an all-time great within MMA as a whole, but in the UFC, he really only lost to the best, right? That final loss on his MMA record against Peter Yan. No shame in losing to one of the greatest fighters to ever step foot in the octagon, man. There's no shame in it. Did lose twice to Dominic Cruz, lost twice to Renan Barão. So clearly he just proved that he wasn't the best of the best because he lost to the best of the best. But still, he didn't have a whole lot of success in the UFC. Didn't really compete against huge names, he competed against huge names, but when he did, he lost. But didn't really pick up great wins against elite competition in the UFC. So for that reason, I'm going to rank him down here in C tier. Chael Sonnen, as Tito Ortiz said, right, the master of the English language, got all of his opportunities using his mouth. It wasn't based off merit. I know the meme is that he's undefeated, never lost a round, all that. I don't subscribe to that notion as much as others do. I think Chael Sonnen is one of the most overrated fighters of all time. I really do think so. Even though he came so close to beating one of the greats in Anderson Silva, he just couldn't quite do it, even though he came so close. Right? Fought John Jones, did not belong to be even like anywhere near that octagon with Jones, honestly. He really didn't. But he did break John Jones's toe, and that fight could have ended in a doctor stoppage for Chael Sonnen if it went a little bit longer. So you know what? Fuck, now that I'm thinking about it, luck could have been on his side against Jones, and he could have captured that belt. He came so close. But we're talking about the best fighters. We're talking about the best. And Chael was never the best. He was never even one of the best. I'm going to put him in C tier. Dan Henderson. Now, while most of his career success didn't come in the UFC, he did have some great fights. I think 2 wins over Shogun Rua, that win over Michael Bisping, aged pretty well, I would say. Lost that second fight against Bisping undeservedly. I thought he probably deserved to win that one, considering he beat Bisping across that octagon, dropped him on multiple occasions, and destroyed his eye. I don't know how Bisping managed to win that fight. I guess maybe you can say that Bisping won more rounds than him, but even then, dude, Dan Henderson was the one landing the big shots. I don't understand it. Did suffer some late career knockouts. That did take away from it, but he still did have a legendary UFC career, put on some excellent fights, right? His second fight, or was it his first fight against Shogun? I'm blanking on that one, but either way, one of his fights against Shogun was arguably the greatest fight of all time. His first two fights in the UFC, I believe, were both title shots against Rampage Jackson, who beat him by decision, and Anderson Silva. Like, come on, yes, he lost to Anderson Silva, but Dan Henderson's an all-time great. So I'll put him in A tier. Justin Gaethje. Now this might be a little premature because technically, yes, he's still competing. He's still in the UFC. He's still contracted by the UFC. But I think he's at the point now where he'll no longer have another title shot. I don't think so. He might turn into a journeyman. Although I'm very ready to be wrong on this one. If Justin Gaethje comes back and goes on another title run and ends up winning that belt, I will be over the moon for him. Believe me, I'm a huge fan of Justin Gaethje, but he still is deserving of being on this list because I think that championship door has closed for him. So when you consider the individuals that he's taken out, right, that recent knockout win over Dustin Poirier, Rafael Fiziev, who else did he beat? Tony Ferguson. Oh my God, he was the one to break Tony Ferguson and break that whole boogeyman facade. He beat Michael Chandler, Donald Cerrone, James Vick. Okay, great win right there. Yeah, Justin Gaethje, man, the more I talk about it, the more I think about it, he came so damn close and was just knocking on that door. Does he deserve to be up there with these guys? I mean, when you compare his resume to a lot of them, he does surpass a lot on this list. So I'm going to put Justin Gaethje in A tier. But once again, unfortunately, he had to exist in the era of these Dagestanis, man. Khabib and Islam. He just can't do it. I know he never fought Islam, but I don't think he would beat Islam personally. Nate Diaz, man, with the kangaroo build. Is he as great as his brother? Within the UFC, yes. I actually think that he's as great as Nick Diaz. If anything, his legacy within the UFC has surpassed Nick Diaz just because he has a win over Conor McGregor, win over Donald Cerrone. Although not a whole lot of super impressive wins throughout his career. I think he also has a win over Gray Maynard, which is pretty good. I think they both have one against one another. So I'm going to put Nate Diaz just for some cohesion. I'm going to put him right beside his brother, Nick. Yeah, I like the look of that. Dustin Poirier, the man who this list is pretty much based off of. I'm going to put him ahead of Yoel Romero here. He is the greatest fighter to never win undisputed gold. He is one of the greatest lightweights of all time. I would say probably like a top 3 lightweight. You could say maybe top 4 lightweight of all time. And really, like when you talk about the best fighters to never be undisputed, I think the first one that comes to mind, it's always going to be Dustin Poirier. His resume is unparalleled, right? A knockout win over Justin Gaethje. A knockout win over Benoit Saint-Denis, who he was counted out in. But even before that, right? Anthony Pettis, Bobby Green, Eddie Alvarez, man. 2 wins over Conor McGregor. 2 wins over Max Holloway. One of the greatest resumes in the history of the sport, despite never being undisputed. The man's a Hall of Famer. He's an all-time great, and he is S tier on this list. Fight me on that one. I don't think there's really any argument to go against it, man. And we get Alistair Overeem. Now, he had a weird UFC career, just fought too many dangerous people. He did get the opportunity, right? Came close to beating Stipe, did hurt him. Developed a very well-rounded game. Even has a win that aged beautifully in Sergey Pavlovich. I think introduced Pavlovich to the UFC and beat him up on the ground and TKO'd him. Yeah, wins over Brock Lesnar when he was Overeem. Frank Mir. Who else did he beat? He beat so many people within the UFC because, despite his chin deteriorating quite quickly, the longevity of his career was actually very impressive, and he did come close. Yeah, and the one that just came to mind right now is he beat Junior Dos Santos. He beat Mark Hunt. He beat the who's who around the heavyweight division at that time, but he just could not get past Stipe, and he just could not get past Ngannou. It's a tough situation because Overeem was that great. He was even seconds away from beating Rosenstrike by decision, and then he got his lip busted, and the fight got stopped at a weird time. So you got unlucky with that one too. Yeah, man, Overeem, the Demolition Man, is one of the greatest to never win UFC gold. Does he deserve to be up here? Maybe he does. Maybe he does. But I'm not too sure. Let me see. Does he deserve to be up there with Demian Maia? Arguably, he had. You know what? Even though Gustafsson is one of my favorites, I'm gonna move him down to B tier and Alistair Overeem up to A tier. I'm putting him at A tier. I think it's fair. Tony Ferguson, unlucky, very, very unlucky, right? The Justin Gaethje fight ruined him, and then he's just been on a terrible run of form ever since then. I can't even really say that Tony Ferguson's only lost to the best, because that isn't the case. Yes, his long, I think 12-fight win streak. I'm a huge fan of Tony, and his winning as Anthony Pettis, that fight in general is one that I'll never forget. RDA, right? He has a win over RDA, win over Edson Barbosa, so he was beating the best of the best at that time, but we just never got to see a prime Tony Ferguson against Khabib, so it's something that we'll never, ever know. But he did capture interim gold. So despite his recent losing streak, he did capture interim gold. So that in and of itself, the way I see it, should actually propel Tony Ferguson up this list. So I will put Tony Ferguson in B tier, and that is the complete list. Guys, let me know in the comment section below what you think about it, and as always, any other future ideas for tier lists that you can think of that you want me to cover, and I will definitely get around to those, because I'm always looking for new ideas, guys. Believe me, there are no shortage of tier list ideas, so please, man, just throw them at me, and let me know in the comment section below what you think about the overall placement of each individual fighter, and which of these on this list is your favorite, and also any fighters that I may have excluded from this list that you think deserve to be mentioned here. So anyway, guys, thank you for watching, and have a good one.